books of the last 100 years, fiction or nonfiction. And I will add that I very much assume Dune will continue to be tremendously influential. The reasons for this are odious. Major themes dealt with in Dune: a world ruined by psychedelic drug addiction. Did you miss that part? A universe dominated by drug dealers, if you like, right? A universe in which there is no democracy at all, in which there is only religious despotism, with an uncanny resemblance to Islam in our time, and in which these sort of corrupt and decadent Muslim despots, rule by working hand in glove with these drug dealers. Now, at the time, critics pointed out the drug combined some features of cocaine, the idea of kind of cocaine cartels, international gangs shipping cocaine, some features of cocaine with what was perceived to be the problem with the oil industry. Now, in many ways, it's not true, but there was certainly a version of reality being presented in the American press that the great nemesis of the United States of America was the OPEC oil cartel. So even the use of cartel in English to describe both drug dealing gangs and oil and gas production internationally. So with these themes set out already, we have a reason why this is not just now, but for the foreseeable future, going to continue to be tremendous influential set of meditations in the form of fiction, in books, movies, and otherwise. Let me ask you a simple question. In the 21st century, what is the single most influential book written by a Buddhist author? Frank Herbert described himself as a Buddhist, and this is very much confirmed by his son. His son provides us with a lot of information about what Frank Herbert's thematic preoccupations were in writing these books. And, although his son is an unreliable witness in some ways, because Frank Herbert's son has gone on to try to make money out of the legacy of Dune, shall we say, in many ways himself, I certainly do think he is a reliable narrator for some very broad and general facts, such as the fact that Frank Herbert described himself at dinner, sitting around casually speaking to friends and relatives, as a Buddhist. Now, the fact that someone describes themselves as a Buddhist does not mean that they accept any part of the teaching of the Buddha. It does not mean they even are aware of the philosophy of the Buddha. But we already have a very strange juxtaposition here. The preoccupation with Islam, some of the most terrifying aspects of Islam, historical, present, and potentially for the future. And this is being written from a self-styled, highly eccentric Buddhist perspective. Now, I can ask you in the audience, do you think Buddhism is a religion that tolerates psychedelic drug use? Do you think Buddhism is a religion that glorifies in any way taking drugs like LSD, ayahuasca, peyote, so on and so forth, for the sake of so-called spiritual insight, for enlightenment of one kind or another, however people may think of these things? The answer is no. In case you didn't know, Buddhism is absolutely committed to teetotalism. What is the world's most common misconception about Buddhism? It probably is the same misconception that Frank Herbert himself labored under. He believed what he wanted to believe about the religion, like most modern white Westerners who get involved in it, and I'm sure he cherry-picked through a few sources for whatever he found most pleasing. Now, another very broad and general fact that is established for the historical record by Frank Herbert's son was Frank Herbert's homophobia and the fact that he had a gay son himself. So I know of two children, Frank Herbert. I apologize if there are in fact three, if there's someone I'm forgetting or what have you. But at any rate, one son is heterosexual or ostensibly heterosexual and goes on to inherit the legacy and write further sequels to the Dune series and be involved with the television adaptations and so on after his father's death. But the other was an openly gay man who very clearly is not accepted by his father and is rejected by his father and has conflict with his father again and again and again. Guess what? This shows up. This homophobia shows up in the books again and again and again. And I can't believe that in 2024, the issues of homophobia and pedophilia are not dealt with first and foremost in the critical reappraisal of reexamination of Dune. Now, okay, there are big issues here. Islam, drug addiction, homosexuality and homophobia, and then pedophilia. We're almost up to a full hand here, a full list of 5 major, critical problems in what Dune meant in its own time to its own author and what it's going to mean now and in the future. Now, some of you are raising an eyebrow and saying, homophobia, what are you talking about? And the first issue that may leap to your mind may be, for example, the villain of the first book, the depiction of him as an evil homosexual. And there are several different rape storylines intersecting with his homosexuality that I dare not even summarize here, frankly. Just in broad brushstrokes, let's remind ourselves. The Dune books, especially, say, the first 3 Dune books, they are very much out of the now forgotten tradition of space opera. So space opera was a genre of fiction, and it's really the explanation for why the Flash Gordon movies are so boring and have aged so badly and nobody can relate to them today. Space opera, anyway. I don't hear a lot of praise in retrospect for space opera as a genre. But this starts off as a somewhat eccentric and somewhat innovative space opera. But certainly one of the ways in which it's innovative, and as I say, it's now odious, is its eagerness to deal with homosexuality and pedophilia. Right? Now, but as the books go on, the issue of homosexuality comes up again and again, always in this very strange, condemning way. The ultimate God Emperor of Dune, as he's called, he favors having a female military. And one of the stated reasons for why he's against a male military, male soldiers, is that it leads to homosexuality. This is not pacifism. This is wonderful. So the issue of a female military comes up again and again through the books. But in case you didn't notice, I think this becomes more blatant as the books go on and on. The author has an unhealthy preoccupation with one of the sort of common justifications for pedophilia, that a girl who is shockingly young can be in a relationship with an adult male because she's like intellectually or mentally she's quote unquote old for her age. So you see this in a lot of fiction written by Mormons, right? And this Frank Herbert, who is a kind of decadent, corrupt, ignorant Buddhist, like to what extent he's Buddhist could be another YouTube video or something. You can say that he's using a sort of pseudo-Buddhist philosophy of reincarnation to say, oh, well, these particular young girls were born as like old souls with these old memories, so they're like mentally mature enough to be sexually active in this way. And it is very obvious that he does not disapprove of this, shall we say. So my point is this. Throughout the books, he is condemning homosexuality of any kind. And to my knowledge, he is wrestling with his hatred of his own homosexual son. He has at least one homosexual son that he has a long conflict with, and this is an established fact. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem that he's wrestling with his hatred of pedophilia. He's wrestling with his justifications and excuses for pedophilia. Now, I took an interest in the Dune novels, and I listened to long audio recordings of interviews with Frank Herbert, the original author. These were unedited, by the way. You could hear the tape clicking. You could hear the reel-to-reel turning over and so on. So these were some interviews recorded by journalists or what have you with Frank Herbert. That went on for, to my memory, went on for hours, but I forget. And I heard some interviews with his son. At a time when I was considering switching into writing novels myself, for me, writing is much easier than what I do here on YouTube, what I'm doing right now in this live stream. I would find it quite easy to write a series of novels. The problem is how many people would read them in 2024. I could write and publish a novel. You can self-publish on Amazon effortlessly now. It's very likely more people would see this YouTube video than a novel that I'd put many, many hours into. But at different times, I've considered, okay, I have these interests in politics and these interests in philosophy. So in that sense, should I spend my time writing something like Dune? Which is to say, should I spend my time constructing a fictional world, that allows me to set out the chess pieces on a board to deal with, divulge, examine, reflect on, meditate on, engage in a sort of profound series of reflections with the audience, or for those who are reading it who are open to the profound elements of the story, but that at the same time is entertaining, exciting, so on and so forth. That would be the idea of writing a work of fiction, as opposed to, writing a philosophical essay or a political tract. So in that sense, Dune interested me, and I had a sincere interest in what the author was trying to accomplish in the Dune books, and to what extent he succeeded or failed, i.e. relative to his own aspirations. Obviously, on a commercial level, the books are massively successful. That's not what I'm questioning here. By the way, a very important footnote was the rejection of the book by all publishers. The first book was rejected, including by specific specialized science fiction publishing houses that had already published Frank Herbert's short fiction. So these were publishers that knew him as a person, they knew his work, and had published his short stories and so on in the past. And they all felt the book was so poorly written that it couldn't be published, despite the fact they published this sort of thing. You guys may or may not know this. The book is eventually published by a technical publishing house. So we look at this, a lot of people misrepresent what happened. But it was a publisher who had never printed any kind of novel, any kind of fiction, had never distributed science fiction or anything of that sort before. It was a publisher who did technical manuals that were distributed to factories and automotive shops, places that did metal work or whatever. And the people in that company read the draft of the novel that was given, and he felt this was so good that he had to publish it. So this is part of the reason why the first edition is a collector's item. Is hard to get and is valuable today. It was published under very, very strange circumstances. But I want to point out the rejection of the manuscript by so many specialized publishers that are every day publishing schlock science fiction. It is significant. And it shows that at a time, at the last moment when people really could regard this with some objectivity, it was regarded as a very poorly written book, which it is. I think we have to admit, both in terms of style and substance, it's very poorly written. But, there is something interesting, which continues to fascinate people to this day with the new movie that's coming out in 2024, new movie that people are excited about right now. And as I say, I think it's going to continue to fascinate people for the rest of my life, for the next century to come. There is something interesting about a white Buddhist man engaging in a critique of Muslim despotism, right? That combines the features of, oil-based energy scarcity domination of the world with an addictive hallucinatory drug-based domination of the world. Now, so again, I would just remind you, the spice melange, the addictive drug, once people become addicted to it, they can never quit. Yeah, it's simply stated that withdrawal symptoms are fatal. So once you start taking the drug, you're an addict for life. You're hopeless. This is a science fiction author who chose not to deal with the possibility of recovery, not to deal with even hypothetical sobriety. Instead, this is a whole universe with, again, no democracy, only despotism, only religious despotism, which can be described as an extremely decadent and corrupt form of Islam, with intentionally selected Muslim verbiage throughout. For most people who read the book at the time, the word jihad was new. Well, we all know the word jihad now in the 21st century. In the 1960s, for many people reading the book, it was the first time they'd seen a lot of these muad'Dib, jihad, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is a jihadist universe. But it is one in which the social class hierarchy is defined by how much of a drug addict you are. So the middle class use moderate and sparing amounts of this very expensive addictive drug, but they're all drug addicts. And then the elite, the higher levels of the aristocratic class, and ultimately the emperor himself, right? They are all total drug addicts for this, ruinous hallucinogenic drug. Now, the only thing, of course, that he obviously could have made up any fiction about this particular drug in this magical universe. I note that the drug makes you live longer, right? It extends your life and in some sense makes you healthier, which is not clear, while at the same time, for example, it changes the color of your eyes. And people want to conceal this. That's also interesting. They do not want to appear to be a drug addict, so people wear contact lenses to conceal that their eye color has been changed by addiction to the drug. And we know it's an idea that's only worked out in a fragmentary way in the later books. He doesn't really explain it in the first book. But the drug, it's not just that it makes you look like a heroin addict in our world, but it gradually transforms you into some kind of horrible subhuman fish-like creature. So there are about 3 sentences about this in all of the books combined. But the filmmakers who've modified this in visual form, I think the people who made the comic books too, their imagination has run wild with this, that if people continue using the drug at a great enough concentration, whether you think of this as an evolution or a devolution, that you're transformed into this hideous fish man floating in a tank. And again, what are the implications of this for our time? Now, the situation of Buddhism in the 21st century is very different from any other religion. I am the harshest critic of Christianity. I utterly despise Christianity. And I actually have videos sincerely arguing about the ways in which Christianity is actually a worse religion than Islam. From an atheist perspective. Obviously, most people feel that if you've got to choose between the two, you'd rather have to deal with Christianity, and I know why. However, there are many unique problems with how terrible a religion Christianity is. Not the topic of today's video. However, it would be incredibly rare to meet someone who is a Christian or is a Christian missionary or is a Christian scholar, someone who is passionate about Christianity, who is fundamentally uncomfortable with the philosophy of Jesus Christ, who is fundamentally opposed to the philosophy, the doctrine of Jesus Christ. Now, we can insert here some snarky remarks that it's not much of a philosophy. It just doesn't add up to much, okay? Buddhism is in this situation where the most influential voices representing Buddhism are precisely people who are highly motivated to misrepresent Buddhism because they do not accept the teaching of the Buddha. They do not accept the doctrine of the Buddha. They do not accept the philosophy of the Buddha. And Frank Herbert is a fantastic example of this, right? Frank Herbert imagines for us a world in which enlightenment, in which knowledge of our past incarnations and knowledge of our future incarnations is brought to us through hallucinogenic drug use, right? And certainly in the 1960s, when the first few books were written, and still today in the 21st century, this is probably the single most difficult poison for Buddhists to deal with, is to say, no, 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 our religion represents sobriety and teetotalism. It doesn't represent or endorse indulgence in these kinds of drugs or the kinds of hallucinations they lead to, right? Now, so I just say, this Frank Herbert is obviously a guy who had his own 1960s counterculture agenda that he simply sought some sort of validation for, if you like, in Buddhism, and was willing to misrepresent and lie to himself about what the Buddha taught, or what you could say why the Buddha's ministry happened to whatever extent. Um, Now, Frank Herbert was a guy who responded to the challenge posed to Western civilization, the Western tradition of democracy or semi democracy that existed in Western Europe, the United States of America, imagining a future in which there is no democracy at all, in which the whole universe is dominated simply by aristocrats and despots, which the universe has permanently regressed to this kind of despotism, and which there is no interest in and no possibility of anything better. And again, this is meditated on, reflected on through novel after novel, through hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's not as if he doesn't have time to do this. He doesn't have time to insert some kind of nuance or other reflection. So, I just want to ask this question, what is the point? What is the point of taking this idiotic, homophobic, pedophilic, pro-drug addict, pro-Muslim tyranny narrative and putting it on a pedestal and celebrating it in the 21st century as great fiction? And what's more dangerous, as if this is great fiction that has a profound personal philosophy that's meaningful in our times. Now, there are young men who have tattoos of quotations from these books, who have tattoos of quotations from the movies. And, these so-called philosophical statements, most of which are drawn from the first couple of books. And I don't know anyone who's passionate about the philosophy espoused in the later books. It'd be interesting. You can do a study on that. Someone get their MA thesis looking at that. But anyway, fear is the mind killer and so on, I feel that what first entered into our culture as a sort of farce with the Star Wars movies is now entering into our culture in deadly earnest, in seriousness, through the Dune movies, through the return of the Dune movies. What can be said when, Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu are dividing the world anew with alliances and misalliances with Saudi Arabia at the center, alliances and misalliances with Turkey and Iran at the center? When once again, the great chessboard of the world has the oil-producing deserts at its center. What is the significance of returning to Dune as this cultural touchstone, of returning to the jihad of Dune? I'm flabbergasted by this. How is it that the 21st century world is sleepwalking through this? At a minimum, we have to say it raises many interesting questions that have to be referred to the moral character and artistic intent of the original author, something that we know from his own interviews, from his own kind of autobiographical writings, and from the biographical writings about him by his son, something that we know in a word to be bad.